I'm Michael Laron, and this is the Writer's Journey podcast, where you get a window into the life of a working science fiction and fantasy author. I'm on a mission to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I share my progress and discover what inspires my books and how I write them. You can find the show notes for today's episode at michaellaron.com/podcast. This week, I'm taking you behind the scenes of my writing process. Hello and welcome to episode 36. In this week's episode, I wanted to spend some time talking about my process for writing my first short story collection, Reconciled People. In last month's behind the scenes episode, I talked about the process of writing my first novel, Magic Souls. I thought I'd do the same thing with Reconciled People. Short stories are different from novels in a number of ways. Since they're shorter, you have to economize and do more with less. You also have to follow a different narrative structure. You can't really follow most major plotting methods. Most short stories revolve around a single event. I've always viewed short stories as the equivalent of short films to full-length movies. Anyway, when I started writing, I said I would never write short stories. I was writing poetry at the time and thought stories were so complicated and mysterious. But one of my writer friends dared me to try it, and I did it and got hooked. For a while, I followed Ray Bradbury's advice and wrote a short story every week, sometimes multiple. I would go to local places like coffee shops and libraries, pick random people, and write long sketches about them, making up details on what their lives might be like. Then I'd adapt those sketches into stories. I did this for about half a year, and most of those sketches were pretty terrible, honestly, since I was honing my craft. This was back in 2012 when I was just starting out. I just forgot about those early stories until I happened across them by pure chance several years later. As I read through them, they were surprisingly cohesive. They were all sketches of everyday people facing a major fear. The opening story, High Wind, is about a Native American running away from his culture. Another story, Origin Story, is about a priest trying to console a young man who experiences a breakdown after his home burns down. Another story, The Lovegram, is about a family man who has to re-examine his own biases after an act of kindness by a stranger. While the stories aren't perfect by any means, nothing a writer does is, they showcase my early curiosity and love of capturing everyday people on the page. One story in particular is really memorable for me. It's called Aw Shuckies, and it's about a girl named Shaquana, a fifth grader who is set to go to the City Museum on a field trip. On this field trip, she plans to declare her love for the boy that she has a crush on. When the field trip is canceled, she spends the day moping, failing to see anything positive. But one random incident at the end of the story completely changes her perspective. More than any of the stories in the collection, I drew it directly from my own fifth grade experience. The excitement on field trip days, the young crushes, the puppy love, the funny camaraderie and witty banter between kids, that was all true for me. And it was fun translating it onto the page. Anyway, I'd love to spend more time talking about Reconciled People since it's my least popular book. I've sold maybe a dozen copies of it at best, and you can of course find a link to it in the show notes, but it's a special book for me. Next week, since there are 5 Thursdays in November, I'll play a sample from the audiobook version of Reconciled People. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed the show, here are a couple ways to help a brother out. If you're listening to this on Anchor, favorite the show. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, do me a favor and write me a review and share it with your friends. You can of course visit my website and learn more about my work at michaellaron.com. If you have a question, send me a voice message on Anchor and you just might hear it on the show. Next week, I'll be giving an update on what I'm currently working on, and I'll be answering your questions. Until then, I leave you with a quote. I love people, watching people interact. It's a lot of psychology. We learn about ourselves by watching other people's lives on the screen. Tatiana Maslany.